Hello, my beautiful friends, and welcome back to Alien Protocols. Those of us who've done just a little bit of research know that in relatively modern times, UFOs have changed shape and appeared differently over time. And it essentially creates these sort of genres where different types were more prominent. And this is a really fascinating aspect of ufology. And of course, it's not just the shapes of the craft, it's also the types of stories reported. You know, there was a period when there were more abductions and medical experiments. And so it's not just the shapes of the craft, but let's do a brief little peek at UFOs throughout history. Let's start relatively early and then we'll go backwards. Now, in the 1890s was a really fascinating phase, and this was the airships. And this was about 20 years before blimps became a reality. And these craft were so weird and interesting, and it really might provide one of the most clear clues about these craft and where they're from and how they're constructed, maybe. Because the weird thing to me is, of course, they have the blimp shape in the center, but they also came with weird, unnecessary, like bat wings and extra rotors and strange other parts that seem really more from science fiction and from the subconscious than having any real aeronautic pertinence. And it's really fascinating how these have these extra parts that seem kind of, in that era, like, oh wow, yeah, giant bat wings might work. Remember, I'm sure you guys have seen the videos of all those crazy flying contraptions, the bicycles with the giant flapping wings, and, it kind of reminds me of that. But there's also a lot of really interesting stories that went along in the 1890s. There was oftentimes people would land out of these craft, they looked just like humans, and they'd ask for a glass of water. That was an ongoing thing from coast to coast. There was even a specific guy who would come out, and I'm forgetting his name, it was like Ralph. And people got reports of Ralph from the east to the west coast. Very, very interesting phase, and really makes you think that it's tied somehow to human expectations, even if just subconscious. Now, there's been a lot of discussion, and I've spoken about it before too, how the craft seem to take the shape and form of near future technology. So, like in the 1920s, and a little earlier and a little later, were the ghost rockets. And these literally were giant cigar shapes that spit out huge plumes of smoke out the back. Now, of course, also there were other shapes. The wacky hat shapes were kind of prevalent as well. But the ghost rockets really were very prominent for this period of time and then disappeared. And just to make this little side point, saucers have been kind of ubiquitous throughout all the different eras. There have been reports of different types of saucers. Now, in the 1980s, we got our first glimpses of the triangle craft with the four-corner engines in the center engine as well, too. There's also several reports of giant flying diamond shapes. There's the Cache Landrum incident, which I think that craft was a U.S. nuclear propulsion craft because it irradiated a woman, another woman, and a kid. And it was very solid medical evidence about their irradiation. And the road was scraped up. Very fascinating. But there also is a very good chance that this craft was, the craft itself could have been recovered, and then they added the nuclear propulsion. And it was right at the time when nuclear propulsion became a reality and a desire by countries around the world. There are also very odd, weird shapes. This kind of shape with a lot of danglings in the 1980s. And strangely enough, there's also quite a few of these odd, strange shapes that have come back only kind of recently. And this was one from the Hatzor kibbutz. It's great video if you haven't seen it. It's shot over 2 nights with a bunch of witnesses, 2 different types of cameras, and you can't even see the whole craft. Someone should actually take the pieces of footage from both of the nights and try to draw as much of the craft as possible. It looks a little bit like this, but there's some vents in it that you can see glowing. It's a really cool craft, really interesting sighting. And then in the 2000 period, we got the Tic Tac. We got a lot of orb shapes. We've got a lot of super illuminated saucers. This was very prevalent in the 2000 period. And in our more modern times, the 2020s, we're getting the geometrics. As I spoke about with Dr. Simeon Hein over 3 years ago, I think, spoke about this new era having these geometrics, and since then you've seen a lot of geometric shapes. And it even came out about these squares that had the circles on the inside that the fighter pilots were seeing on the East Coast. I think that was the Roosevelt incident. A lot of triangles we're seeing, a lot of triangles, pyramids. Some of these odder, weirder shapes. And, of course, fleets. And, of course, this isn't the only period of time that UFOs have been reported. They've been reported for many, in many different cultures for many, many years. In China, in ancient China, they would say that their leaders flew in from the sky, from the stars, on dragons. That might be a little subjective. But in Tibet, they said that the first 7 kings from Tibet flew in on these special types of orbs, these clear circular orbs, and that they used these orbs to travel, and travel through the stars, to the stars and through the stars. Really cool and fascinating. The Zulus from Africa spoke about the star travelers. And the star travelers would go from star to star, and they came to Earth to mine. That's in Zulu tradition. In the Hopi tradition, which is incredibly fascinating, there was an incredible sighting that happened in 1947 that's spoken about, where they talk about this craft that had crashed. It was made of an incredibly strong, shiny material, and a being came out of it, and the being spoke with them. The being's name was Bakti, and spoke to them about a lot of different aspects of the universe. And the Hopi were very ahead in some areas of knowledge. The Hopis had the Kachinas, and Kachinas are the watchers. How cool is that? And the watchers were from space and had flying devices and flew from place to place. Really fascinating. Of course, in India, you had the Vihmannas, a lot of ancient texts. And you wonder, humans, modern humans, they say, have been around for 12,000 years, since the Ice Age. There's a giant glacier that covered the entire planet. And some of it was as much as 100 miles deep. Like in New York, I think it was over 100 miles deep. And then it receded. and modern humans were supposed to be these first groups. But you know humans have been around for longer than 12,000 years. 12,000 years, you know, it goes by fast. 50 years goes by super fast. And you wonder when and how and what happened with those other humans going back tens of thousands of years. You know, right after the Ice Age, humans were super smart. And you can tell that for sure because the oldest archaeological structures all around the world are the best constructed, the best rock work. There's some amazing science that goes back to that period. That wasn't really recaptured until just a few hundred years ago even. Incredibly fascinating. You know, we have to kind of ask ourselves, where are we from? You know, what has influenced us? Who has influenced us? It's possible, it's probable even, that humans have been influenced by watchers of some kind. This is the Atsurobuni Craft. There we go. Atsurobuni from 1804, recorded in Japan and recorded by different people. The craft was drawn and looked very much like this. It had shiny reflective parts. It had a meshy kind of vent. They said it had like a vent, and it had a hatch that opened, and what came out? A beautiful redhead. Seriously, they report that a red-headed woman came out, and she was tall. And the craft itself had unknown writing on it, which reminds me a lot of Rendlesham and the Rendlesham craft. And this was 1804, but it was recorded dutifully by a bunch of different writers at the time. And a craft very much like this, which in many ways looks kind of like the Rendlesham craft, with a lot of these little triangle facets and red and blue balls of light, circles of light, is reported in ancient Chinese texts that go back to 1400, year 1420, I think it is. And that this craft came and visited, and there were beings in there that had different colored hair and were very tall, and they came in these craft and visited over several years, bringing them different science and different social ideas and concepts, and an herb, a very interesting herb. I think it was a hallucinogenic herb, is the inference of some of the ancient writings. And they talked about, and this is very interesting too, these balls of light that came out, some would come in pairs and circle each other. And they would talk about them circling and separating. And we see that in modern times with orbs. So this phenomena, you know, the older historical data and information is, you know, more difficult to accept. But when it comes as well documented as some of these, and you guys remember from, you know, the previous episode that I did about the famous Nuremberg wood carving in 1561. Nuremberg wood carving looked almost exactly like this. The incident of the orbs flying in the sky and this conflict when they're fighting, and bright blood being shared between the different craft. That sure sounds like lasers to me. And this is fact. This is historical fact. The wood carvings are dated very reliably. And then also in 1566 in Basel, Switzerland, the same exact kind of combat occurred in the skies, with a lot of the same type craft and circular orbs. So you have to ask yourself, what does this all mean? What does it all mean? Are we being influenced? Are we being conditioned? Maybe we are being conditioned to do different things at different times just to see what happens. Maybe they do a little bit more than just watch. What do you guys think? Much love.